These are volume spacers, and they can completely change how your bike rides. So today I'm going to show you how to change the volume spacers in your Fox DPS as well as DPX2 shock, and talk a bit about the benefits of changing your volume spacers and some tuning tips as well. So what are volume spacers? And they come in the form of little plastic tokens or little bands, and they can either increase or reduce the volume of your shock depending on which spacer you have from factory. So essentially the bigger or more spacers you have, you're reducing the overall volume of your air chamber, and then the opposite if you're taking out spacers. And when you reduce the overall volume of your shock by adding more spacers or putting a bigger one in, you're essentially making it more progressive. In absolute layman terms, when I'm talking about progression, I'm essentially talking about how hard it is to bottom out the shock. So if you've got a very progressive spring, it's going to be harder to bottom out your fork or shock. And you'll find the reason most people use a volume spacer is exactly this. They're bottoming out too much, so they'll put a bigger one in. So using the example of the rear shock, say you're running 30% sag and you're kind of happy with your air spring, but you're bottoming out too much. So a lot of people, they add a bit more pressure, but that's negatively gonna affect how your spring feels. So it'll feel a little bit harsh, not as sensitive. So the best thing to do would to be add a bigger volume spacer. And again, if you're happy with kind of the sag you're at and you're never getting close to bottoming out your shock, you probably want to put a small spacer in. So that's keeping it as simple as possible, and that's why most people use volume spacers. But I like to think of them as a valuable tuning tool, and I'll always kind of adjust my spring as well as the progression first, and then I'll kind of go into tuning rebound and compression later. So let me run you through changing the spacers on my Polygon Siskiyou T8, so I'll show you how to do it, and then kind of some of my methodology to kind of really getting the setup that I really want out of the bike. So starting off with the stock setup, so from factory, I've messed around with the volume spacers already, but I put the factory one back in. If you're a bit confused and you don't want to open up the shock and know what it has from factory, if you look up the individual code on the shock, so on Fox stuff it'd have an ID code, put that into the website and it will let you know the tune of the shock as well as what spacer it has in it from factory. So starting off with the bike at 30% sag, which is around 17 millimeters, I have 170 PSI and it has the 0.4 spacer. And with this current setup, it was similar to what I experienced on my Marin Alpine Trail. There's nothing wrong with suspension, this is kind of just the tuning process. So I found that one, I was bottoming it out too easy, so that's gonna be an indicator that I probably wanna put a bigger spacer in it. But the main thing was, I felt like it was a little bit harsh and I was kind of getting a bit too much feedback from the pedals. So how I usually fix this, along with obviously putting the bigger spacer in to help with kind of the bottom out resistance there, putting in a bigger spacer, you can run a little bit less pressure to achieve the same amount of sag. And when I kind of change the spacers, I'll show you the pressure a little bit later and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So let's change the spacer over. So the first thing you want to do, you want to clean all the frame around it, make sure it's all clean. You don't want any kind of dirt or grit getting inside the shock. Then you want to start taking the air out of the shock. So wind on your shock pump and then release around 50 PSI at a time. Every 50 PSI, you want to push down on the saddle just to the point kind of around sag and you should hear an audible hiss. This is what you want to hear. This is the positive and negative chambers equalizing. So stop and do this every 50 PSI until you get down to zero. Once you get down to zero, take off the shock pump, just check with an Allen key to make sure all the air's out. And then what I like to do is slow the rebound all the way down and then also open the shock. Just means it's going to pop off less abruptly. It just makes things a little bit easier. Then you want to take off the air can. With most Fox shocks, you should be able to do this by hand, but you might need a strap wrench. But what I like to use, I've just got a kind of an exercise band. It's really grippy. Wrap that around. It gives you a little bit more grip to undo the air can. Once you've done this, pull down the air can, not all the way off, especially if it's on the frame, and then make sure if you've got kind of more of a level shock that none of the oil's coming out. And now you can change the volume spacer. So you want to pull down the rubber O-ring and then the kind of shim or washer there and pull that down out of the way, not all the way. And then you want to remove the volume spacer. And you want to be really careful here, probably wrap your screwdriver in something that's not going to scratch the shaft in there, because if you damage that, that's going to be a pretty expensive bill for you. And then you just want to pry the token out and it should pop out. At this point, you can put in whatever space you want. So I've chosen 0.8, so I've gone from the 0.4 all the way up to the 0.8. I like to do a bigger jump and then come back. It's kind of more bracketing, so you want to get a bigger change, and then if you notice there's a huge change and you kind of want to tone it back, then you can go in between. But I usually find making a bigger difference to really notice the changes is what's best. And once you've done that, all you need to do is just pop in the other spacer. Make sure you have the Fox logos and that stuff pointing down. You want the flat part of the spacer to be in the top part of the shock, so that's going to be the part that you don't see. And then once it's clicked in, move that kind of shim or washer back up, and then the O-ring, and then you can push your air can up and then redo it. And then you want to tighten it up by hand as kind of firm as you can with your hand. You probably don't need a strap wrench, especially on these Fox ones, but I still like to do it pretty tight with that kind of exercise band. At this point, now it's all tight, you can start pumping up your shock again. So again, kind of do those 50 PSI increments, really equalizing the chambers as you go up. So as I said earlier, you will require a little bit less pressure to achieve the same sag. So on this setup with the 0.8 spacer to get 30% sag, so that's 17 millimeters there, I only needed 155 PSI instead of that 170 that I had before. So at this point, just get your rebound and compression settings and then the shock's pretty much set and ready to go. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm excited to see how this feels. Even just going around the garage, I found with that 0.4 spacer with that 30% sag, I was still bottoming out the shock. So I'm really excited to see how this 0.8 spacer is really gonna change things on the trail. So that's gonna be the best place to test it. So let's go to the trail and see what the differences we notice are. So we're on the trails now, we're at Daisy Hill. So this is your first taste of Queensland trails. So my first ride here. So I don't really know what I'm getting myself into. It is kind of more mellow XC, kind of lighter trail stuff, so it shouldn't be too bad. But yeah, the main thing when you're kind of testing a new setup up, you want to do it on a familiar trail, but I don't have that luxury. So we're going to drop into one of the descents up here called Chipline, and we'll see how it feels. It looks more like a flowy trail, so it should give us a good indication of kind of the ride manners. And then we'll hit some jumps and see how the progression is. Dropping into Chipline, so excuse me if I miss any lines first time. Nice pedally start. Let's push into this corner too. Yeah, so immediately more progressive. Can push into things a little bit easier. Oh, this is nice and flowy. I think I almost got it. Yeah, so immediately more confidence on the bike. Before I was kind of a bit scared to hit anything big, but I know I've got that support there now. Really fun trail, but hard work. We don't really get anything like this in Sydney. Dropping into Koala now, so yeah, nice and fun. I'm so stoked to have these trails in my backyard. Nothing too crazy, but good fun. Definitely a little bit more sensitive as well. I'm not getting as beat up on the small chatter, even though there's not much here, but it's definitely noticeable. Oh, so much better. Okay, sounds really good. Let's head over to some jumps now, and we can see a bit more how that progression is, but immediately on that trail on those small doubles, so much better. Okay, heading down the jump line now. I lost my helmet. I put it down somewhere, so I had to find it, but running out of daylight, so hopefully this looks okay, but let's test out the progression. Okay, these ones won't be a good test. There's a nice one to flat coming up now. Yeah, so much better. I might be able to up the pressure slightly more. Missed that one. Buddha here. Whoop. Yeah, I think we're pretty much close to spot on. I'm happy with that. So nice and progressive. Definitely heaps better over the small bump. So I'll see you at home and I'll go over my final thoughts. So there you go, just finished up the ride. As you can tell, my new trails, they're kind of super flowy, more kind of XC trail, but really good fun. So hopefully take you guys on a few more rides like that in the future. But yeah, talking about the volume spaces and stuff like that, the suspension feels so much better. I'll go into a bit more depth about all the suspension, that kind of stuff like that in the Siskiyou T8 long-term reviews. So that'll be coming out probably in the next few weeks or month. So really stoked to kind of give you guys my final thoughts on the bike. But yeah, if you've got this bike, definitely the 0.8 spacer is the way to go, especially if you're intending to push the bike towards its limits. So main takeaways, a little bit more sensitive, so definitely a little bit better on those kind of small chatter, less feedback through the pedals, and you're getting a lot more progression. So you can really push into those corners a bit more, and then on jumps and stuff like that, drops, there's definitely a fair bit more support. But yeah, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to drop a like, also leave a comment as well. If you want me to do more POV, kind of more riding videos, definitely let me know as well. It's something I've kind of avoided in the past because I'm not really the best rider, but if enough of you guys want to see it, I'll do a bit more. But yeah, if not, I'll stick to my reviews. But as always guys, thanks for watching. See ya.